Okay, good morning, everyone. So thank you all for joining us today, for everyone expressing interest in our meeting. I'd like to welcome you all to the third webinar for our Research and Evaluation Network for the year. The theme of the webinar today is data capability, quantifying the community value of neighbourhood centres in Queensland. In terms of membership, these network meetings are open to everyone as they're about sharing resources and collaboration. However, social service staff in research and evaluation roles are particularly encouraged to attend. So to join, or if you have any questions you would like to follow up with the team from today's session, or any of the work of the research and evaluation team, research and advice team, please email us at research@qcoss.org.au. So today I'm going to give a quick introduction or 15-minute discussion around data capability. I'm then going to hand over to our guest speaker for today's session, Chris Mundy, the Sector Development Lead for Policy, Research and Networks at Neighbourhood Centres Queensland. A couple of housekeeping rules for today. If you're not already, can you please put yourself on mute? If you have a question, please use the chat function. There'll also be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of Chris's presentation. And also to note, this session will be recorded. So if you don't want your face shown in the recording, please feel free to turn your camera off. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land of the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people on the lands on which I work here in Meanjin, Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge all First Nations colleagues joining us online today. QCOSS thanks First Nations peoples for the gift of the Uluru Statement from the heart. We look forward to supporting and leading to a successful referendum to enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution, followed by Makarrata and Treaty. QCOSS welcomes the invitation to walk with First Nations people in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. For those online today, please feel free to join us in acknowledging the country where you are today through the chat function as well. So I'd like to welcome and thank also our QCOSS members for joining us today and really acknowledge the work that you're doing in your communities. I'd also like to do some quick introductions and acknowledge some colleagues online today. Scott Brown, our QCOSS Director for Research and Advice. And I'd also like to acknowledge the support of Michael and Maria, who's helped me with this webinar today. Thank you so much for your support. So my name is Amy Delit. I'm the Data and Reporting Analyst in the Research and Advice team at QCOSS. And a component of my role is to coordinate these Research and Evaluation Network meetings. So this year, we've really tailored our Research and Evaluation Network activities to focus on data capacity strengthening and supports. So we've structured our activities, including the topics for these webinars, based around 5 domains, which are data infrastructure, data impact, data capability, data governance, and data access. The domains were selected and informed by the Swinburne University of Technology, Building Data Capacity in the Not-for-Profit Sector report. It was released last year, as well as the ongoing work we've also conducted with the sector, including our data systems case studies and our data evidence and evaluation needs assessment surveys. In previous years, we've had, in previous webinars, we've had discussions around data infrastructure and data impact, and the recordings from these webinars are available. So if you'd like to catch up on any of these topics, please get in touch and we can send you a link to those recordings. So the focus of today, again, is around data capability. The Building Data Capacity in Not-for-Profit Sector report defines data capability as the ability to utilise big data technologies, management systems, and open data platforms to obtain, integrate, and analyse data and carry out data prediction and application. So what is the difference between data capacity and data capability? Data capacity is the overall abilities and extent to which an organisation can make use of data. It encompasses all of the 5 domains we've been referencing this year: data infrastructure, data access, data governance, data impact, and data capability. Whereas data capability is more specifically concerned with the skills and competencies of professional roles established to work with data. In practice, data capability has been used interchangeably with terminology such as data ability data literacy, and data competence to describe a specific area of data expertise, such as information processing capability, data engineering, data visualization, and predictive analytics. So in the same report, it gives us some suggested prompts and practical ways to think about and reflect on the data capacity domains and how they relate to the organisation that we work within. So for data capability, some of these prompts are: who works with data in your organisation? What are their levels of data expertise? What are the necessary data skills for your organisation in terms of technical and operational skills versus strategic and forward-thinking skills? And what is your organisational culture towards data? Is there a willingness to build data skills within your organisation? And what are the enablers and constraints for data capability building in your organisation or for the sector more broadly? And how do we measure our capability? Data capability can be measured in terms of workforce skills, system readiness, and organisational culture. An organisation's data capability is dependent on the combined strategic use of various resources, including a collection of data sets, skills, competencies, and cultural values. So in this report by the Australian Government Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, it highlights the data skills and capability in the Australian Public Service. It states that data skills are essential for all employees to support evidence-based, informed decision-making, whether it's in policy development, program management, or service delivery. These skills also assist in improving operational efficiency, more efficient resource allocation, and improved engagement with stakeholders. The report outlines these specific data roles and definitions as a good reference point for APS employees and agencies to determine the skills and capabilities required in their roles involved with the interpretation, analysis, and collection of data. The specific roles are referenced here on the slide, and they're also, the definitions are included too. So they've looked at data analysts, data scientists, data architects, data infrastructure engineers, and data policy and law experts. However, in the not-for-profit sector, our data skill sets and roles look more like this. So this is a visualization I've created of some of the job roles of people who have registered for today's event. Not-for-profits and community service organisations often don't have the resources available to have dedicated positions like data scientists and analysts and data infrastructure engineers and data architects and data policy and law experts. So community services often rely on subject or system experts, clinical managers, coordinators, managers, project officers, and team leaders to provide input at all stages of the data lifecycle, including the collection, extraction, collation, analysis, and communication of the results. So results from our 2021 Data Evidence and Evaluation Needs Assessment Survey reiterate these assumptions. So our survey highlighted significant challenges and barriers to collecting and analysing data for the community services sector. 56% of organisations indicated that positions are not funded to undertake data analysis, and 38% noted that staff skills are limited in data analysis. When asked what support does your organisation require to improve data quality, 56% of community service organisations listed a need for support for staff resourcing and or training, which included dedicated positions to analyse data, upskilling staff on statistical concepts and analytics, and education and training for staff on data collection, capture, and recording of quality data. Community services are not alone in these challenges. So this report was released by the Australian Public Service Commission in 2020. It's called APS Data Professional Stream Strategy, Strengthening Data Capability Across the APS to Generate Deeper Insights, Inform Evidence-Based Decisions, and Enable More Effective Service Delivery. So the report found 73% of APS agencies identified employee skills and capability as a barrier to the use of data. Data analysts and scientists were identified as the among the top 10 emerging job roles for Australia. Australian job postings for data science roles rose by 58% in 2018, which was 5 times higher than they were in 2014. And of the APS agencies that identified critical skill shortages, 70% identified skill shortages in data. So in this report, I really quite like how it outlines the positive outcomes and benefits resulting from the efforts that focus on and invest in data capability. It looks at outcomes, which I've adapted here slightly to focus on the perspectives of communities, community service organisations, and individuals and teams. So for example, for communities, the outcomes and benefits may be that they have access to simple, reliable, tailored and timely programs and services. For organisations, they are able to understand data effectively to inform policy, advice, regulation and services. And for individuals and teams, they might become more confident and capable data producers and users throughout their careers. So other benefits and outcomes are listed on the slide, which you can read in your own time. So on the Better Evaluation website, it references a brief diagnostic rubric that asks, how would you rate the systems approach in your organisation? It uses a rating system of beginning, progressing and established. And this example is specifically around monitoring and evaluation. So I'm not going to pull all of these out today, but if we were looking at a few examples of well-established systems, we would say monitoring and evaluation is widely used to inform planning, decisions and actions, and how we work with other organisations, including meeting reporting requirements. There's effective leadership for monitoring and evaluation, and policies and procedures are in place with clearly defined roles and responsibilities at all levels of the organisation. There are enough people with the skills and dedicated time to support or do monitoring and evaluation, and there are effective mechanisms for coordinating or collaborating with others within our organisation and or other organisations to support or do monitoring and evaluation. The monitoring and evaluation plan supports our organisational strategy. Monitoring data are collected timely and with high quality. And organisations undertake evaluations and research in priority areas. They are adequately resourced and managed, done in culturally appropriate ways, produce credible and useful findings, and used to inform decisions and action. So the Data Capability Framework is a tool by the New Zealand government, which was designed to define and develop data and analytical capabilities at an individual, team, or potentially organisational level. So the Data Capability Framework defines 25 capabilities that are associated with data use, and these capabilities are grouped into 7 stages of the data life cycle, which are plan, collect, describe, store, analyze, use, and save and destroy. So many of the capabilities naturally fall into more than one category. So here there's the 25 capabilities listed on the left-hand side. So I apologise, the writing is potentially quite small, but some of the examples are employ data coding and classification principles, integrate data, identify and understand data availability, employ data collection methodology, contribute to the sourcing and use of administrative data, describe and summarise data, improve data processes, systems and products, identify research questions, apply data governance guidance, and visualise data. So this is just one example of one of the capabilities. So the capability here is to employ data coding and classification principles. So the category which relates to the different stages of the data lifecycle spans across the describe, store, use, save and destroy categories. So each capability is then described with 3 levels of skill or knowledge: new, proficient and expert. So for this capability, the level or skill of knowledge that can be reached here for new is they are aware of relevant data classifications and coding protocols and their proper application to data in general. And they know who to consult for expert knowledge. If they have proficient capabilities, they have a comprehensive knowledge of data classifications and coding protocols, and they know where to obtain expert advice about coding and classifications as needed. If they're classified as having expert capabilities, they are consulted regularly by others about data classifications and coding protocols, and they can employ conceptual frameworks in support of data classification and coding. So again, this is just one example of the 25 capabilities in this document, and it goes through all of the rest of the 24 if you're interested in learning more about this further. So the New Zealand framework that I've just gone through was actually also developed and adapted then by the Australian Public Service Commission to the Australian context. So this framework is very similar to the New Zealand framework, which also spans across the data lifecycle. However, the prepare category is now a new stage that they've added to the data lifecycle, and then they've also combined the analyze and use categories together. There are 26 data capabilities instead of 25, and they're based on a proficiency scale of foundational, intermediate, and advanced, instead of the new proficient and expert ratings. So here's all of a summary of the resources that we've touched on today, which are the 4 resources in the middle there listed: the Data Capability Framework Guide by the New Zealand Government, the Data Skills and Capability in the Australian Public Service, the APS Data Professional Stream Strategy, and the APS Data Capability Framework. So all of these tools are really useful in understanding existing strengths and needs at individual, team, and organisational levels. It's a good starting point to determine what capabilities can be built on, how best to identify and address important gaps in skills over time, and areas where to focus effort and to build capabilities and skills that are developing or need strengthening. I've also included 2 other resources here. So the Evaluators Professional Learning Competency Framework, which is by the Australian Evaluation Society. It's a framework to guide evaluation knowledge and expertise and improve the quality of evaluation practice in Australia. It looks at 7 domains of competence: evaluative attitude and professional practice, evaluation theory, culture, stakeholders and context, research methods and systematic inquiry, project management, interpersonal skills and evaluation activities. And then there's also sector-specific competencies and capabilities that may be relevant. So for example, the Australian Health Informatics Competency Framework, released earlier this year by the Australian Institute of Digital Health. And these competencies relate specifically to data professionals working at the intersections between health and informatics. So everyone, yeah, definitely please feel free to share any other resources or documents in the chat pane that you may be aware of that can inform, support, build or strengthen the data capabilities of our sector. So this leads us into our guest speaker component of our discussion today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's session, Chris Mundy. Chris has worked with the Neighbourhood Centres Queensland in a variety of areas and now leads the sector in forwarding neighbourhood centre data and research, social policy influence and developing sector networks. Chris has over 20 years of experience in community work in a wide variety of contexts, including both individual support and community programs. He spent 10 years working with teenagers, community groups, and stakeholders in a high school context, using community development methods to address issues of mental health, self-harm, social justice, and youth crime. His experience in neighbourhood centres entailed further community development experience, as well as a volunteer management, consortium work, and financial resilience. Chris has also supported individuals and groups affected by past forced adoption practices, as well as conducted research and advocacy in this area. Chris has studied a Bachelor of Ministries from the Australian College of Theology, Graduate Diploma of Psychology at QUT, and a Master of International and Community Development PhD pathway at Deakin University. His multidisciplinary background brings a variety of research, practice, and systems perspectives to his work, which is ideal to demonstrate the diverse nature and value of neighbourhood centres across the state. So Chris is going to facilitate a discussion here around quantifying the community value of neighbourhood centres in Queensland. I think this work is a really fantastic example of the type of capabilities that exist within the sector And hopefully we can really draw on this knowledge to inform future work and methodologies, really thinking about what methodologies we can use to highlight the value of the sector and the contributions community services provide to communities. So at the end of Chris's presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'll now hand it over to Chris. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Amy. It's really good to come along today and share with you all our data journey over the past couple of years. And it has been a real journey. I still feel like a learner in the space, coming from a community development background. Kind of all this stuff to do with numbers and that sort of stuff is a little bit foreign to me. But it's been really good to see how much the neighbourhood centre sector has achieved over the past few years, especially with the recent budget announcement that there is going to be some more dollars heading towards neighbourhood centres. And we know that a major part of that was the result of collecting data about neighbourhood centres, and that being used to demonstrate the value of the sector. So I'll just share my screen here. So just acknowledging the country that we're on. I'm on Gubbi Gubbi country today, and just acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, and please take a moment to consider the land that you're on too. One of the beautiful things that I notice about land where I am is how much things are flowering at the moment, especially the grevilleas that are attracting the lorikeets and also the native raspberries. And it's just amazing to consider the people who have gone before to look after the land that I'm on and who will continue to look after the land. So a little bit about our timeline for neighbourhood centres in Queensland. They actually go right back to the 70s. And when we look at neighbourhood houses in Australia, they actually go back to the very early 1900s. The very first neighbourhood centre was established in Redfern in around about 1901. It started operations, but to fast forward to 2012, the neighbourhood centre sector took a real hit in Queensland, and the organisation that's now known as Neighbourhood Centres Queensland was totally defunded. So we were limping around a fair bit. Neighbourhood centres received funding cuts, and there was the Fair Work decision to increase wages. However, there was no increase in funding for neighbourhood centres in any kind of supplementary funding. So we were kind of limping along for a long time. In 2015, we were funded to conduct a results-based accountability exercise. So results-based accountability is a way that that neighbourhood houses are measured in some of the other states, like Neighbourhood Houses Tasmania, and the Queensland government was looking at a new way to measure neighbourhood houses up here, neighbourhood centres in Queensland. They're called houses down south. So we trialled a results-based accountability framework, and it was kind of half implemented by the department, in that the department started collecting only outputs of neighbourhood centres rather than the process of how neighbourhood centres went about the work and what kind of outcomes or impact it was having. So in 2017, we were funded by the Queensland government to have one worker, and that worker worked with QCOSS to undertake an investment management standard exercise with the department, and that was a fairly kind of comprehensive survey, but still kind of didn't achieve any significant results for the sector. in 2019, Griffith University undertook some research on neighbourhood centres. They found that there was actually no kind of data that was being useful data that was being gathered about neighbourhood centres. And so when I came on board, I think our organisations had some discussions about, wouldn't it be good to have a social return on investment or something like that, so we could actually demonstrate what neighbourhood centres were doing, particularly towards funding bodies, and got some quotes around that and way out of our price range. And so then we started to work with Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, which I'll go into a little bit more. And we conducted our first annual survey of neighbourhood centres in 2020 during lockdown, during the pandemic. We also designed a new reporting and performance framework for neighbourhood centres for the Queensland government that's being currently considered by the Sector Repositioning Committee that the government has established, the Minister has established. And we did our second annual survey of neighbourhood centres in 2021. So the challenging thing about collecting data about neighbourhood centres is they're all very different from one another. And so there's this phrase that if you visited one neighbourhood centre, you visited one neighbourhood centre, in that kind of the services that each neighbourhood centre offers can be completely different to the next neighbourhood centre, because their strength is that they're focused on their local community and what that local community needs. And so what one community needs may not be what another one needs. And so there's all very different types of activities and services. So you've got to figure out kind of, actually what data and what activities should we be gathering. But even though neighbourhood centres are very different from one another, they do have a broader identity across the state. Nationally, there's a national peak body of neighbourhood centres. There's also an international peak body of neighbourhood centres, the International Federation of Settlements and Neighbourhood Centres, that has consultative status with the United Nations. And they have a historical identity. So neighbourhood centres started off as settlement houses in around about the 1880s, 1890s in England, and then kind of spread throughout Europe and over to the US, where Jane Addams, the godmother of social work, started Hull House in Chicago, and have spread throughout the European world. So there is some kind of commonalities in what neighbourhood centres do on a statewide, nationally and internationally. They're complex to measure. I think community development is a complex thing to measure because the community development aims of each community may be very different. So, one local community may want to do a project around crime, another community might want to do something around mental health, even another community might want to do something around like transport or a bus service. And so how do you measure the commonalities between all those different projects and then prove that in what neighbourhood centres do as a whole? The other complex thing is that one of the strengths of the sector is universal access, where anyone can rock up to a neighbourhood centre and get kind of help or assistance or guidance or being linked into an activity. And with a lot of that, the less intrusion, the better. It's one of the strengths of a neighbourhood centre is that you can go and get some advice without having to kind of give all of your personal details or your life, too much of your life story and that sort of thing. Whereas with other human services that are more case management models, there's a lot more kind of information and data that's gathered. And because there's such a wide variety of services that neighbourhood centres offer, you'd need kind of like 50 different social return on investments to actually kind of figure out, what all of the neighbourhood centres do and what their value is and all of that kind of thing. But having said that, what started to emerge in Victoria is that there were some social return on investments being done down there on neighbourhood houses, on the common things that all neighbourhood houses and centres were doing. The first one was in 2018, Deloitte did a social return on investment on one neighbourhood house at Morwell, which a lot of our calculations are based on. And then Deloitte did another social return on investment on a group of neighbourhood houses using a slightly different methodology from the first neighbourhood house. And so they use quality adjusted life years to come up with some kind of figure on the social value that those neighbourhood houses were producing. So the quality adjusted life year is kind of like a benchmark kind of figure that a lot of health services and those sort of, yeah, it's kind of like this value that's placed on a quality year of life that has different components to it, like economic, mental health, physical health, social connection, and that sort of stuff. So Deloitte used the quality of adjusted life year to calculate a social return on investment. And that's just a little bit about their kind of the method that they used. And as part of that, they interviewed people who are accessing the neighbourhood houses down there, and they found that 57% of participants in activities said that they were receiving some kind of social connection benefit. And so they fed that into the quality of adjusted life year. They worked out how much social connection value was connected with a quality of adjusted life year, and they came up with these percentages here. So this formula enabled some kind of social value calculation based on the number of participants that were coming into neighbourhood centres, receiving some kind of social connection benefit that that could be used further. We found that there are other return on investments being done that were also of relevance to neighbourhood centres. So Food Bank did a social return on investment on the kilos of food they were giving out and the amount of social connection benefit they were receiving from that. Which was of relevance to neighbourhood centres that were giving out food. And also Volunteering Queensland had a replacement cost calculator. In fact, I think the other peak bodies in the other states were also doing this as well, where there's a calculator that's done for volunteer replacement costs based on number of hours volunteers were contributing to organisations, which is really useful. So then we decided to get a little help from our friends down in Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, who had been doing surveys of their neighbourhood house network since 2012. So a good 10 years of surveying their network of, they have over 400 neighbourhood houses down there, quite a large network. And they were starting to use these social return on investments from Deloitte in their surveys, and the other return on investments as well from Food Bank and Volunteering Queensland. And they were actually, as a result of their survey, able to produce some kind of community value on investment of in their network down there. And through forming a friendship with them, the guy who was doing those surveys down there was able to mentor me in how to conduct the survey and how to start collecting the data in Queensland. So then we decided to embark on this survey journey or the data journey. And so we commenced our first annual survey in 2020. And the kind of data that we gathered is not about everything that neighbourhood houses do, but it's data about what most of the neighbourhood centres do. So most neighbourhood centres have participants that come in and are involved in activities. Most neighbourhood centres have volunteers. 74% of neighbourhood centres conduct emergency relief. So we had a survey week, accounting week, where each neighbourhood centre were asked to provide data on how many participants in activities, how many volunteers they had, how many hours in that week volunteers were giving, how much emergency relief was being given out per month, and other things that could be benchmarked. So I know that some neighbourhood centres offer tax help, which is normally valued at around about, a tax return is $100 if you go somewhere else to get a tax return. And frozen food, room hire is normally benchmarked around $35 an hour. Auspicing as well. So for other organisations, if they weren't being auspiced by the neighbourhood centre, they would have to take out public liability insurance in order to run their activities. So we got a quote for how much it would cost for public liability insurance for these organisations, and the amount of value that neighbourhood centres were contributing to the local community by providing that public liability insurance to them. And we also gathered some other data sets, like the types of services neighbourhood centres were offering, workforce size, the buildings that they were operating from. And that was really useful data to gather, because even though we don't publish a lot of that data, whenever an organisation, say, approaches us and said, well, we're looking at running a new program through neighbourhood centres, we want to know what percentage of neighbourhood centres are offering digital literacy to seniors. We have that data there, we have those statistics, and that can be used to design new programs for neighbourhood centres and that kind of thing. So that's just a bit about our survey participation that we had in 2021. So we had 76 neighbourhood centres complete the surveys, which was around about 53% of neighbourhood centres in Queensland. So in order to estimate how much the entire sector is producing, we take the figures that are provided through the survey participants. We calculate medians from those, the data that we gather from the survey participants, and then we assign those medians based on different population sizes to all of the neighbourhood centres that didn't participate in the survey, and are able to come up with a rough estimate on what the sector is doing. That's a little bit about our extrapolation that we apply to this, the data that we get from the survey participants, and then assign them to the ones that don't participate. It's all based on population sizes. So we divide neighbourhood centres into different population sizes. Neighbourhood centres in metropolitan areas roughly attract the same number of participants and volunteers and that sort of stuff as, other ones in metropolitan areas with same population sizes, and the ones in, say, rural small communities also have access, also attract kind of roughly similar participant sizes and volunteers and that kind of thing. So we're able to kind of confidently predict or estimate how much all of the neighbourhood centres that didn't participate in the survey actually typically perform and do. And we also attach some extrapolation techniques to estimating things across an entire year. So we take an average week, we add in the medians for the neighbourhood centres that didn't participate, and then we multiply kind of the average week across the entire year. So we use 50 instead of 52 because without neighbourhood centres are normally closed for the Christmas week and Easter and public holidays and other things like that. So that's how we calculate those big figures, those estimated values. So this goes into a little bit more detail on how we did that for each of the different population areas. So if we take things like, you know, the number of people attending centres, there's a median of 230 people per neighbourhood centre in a metropolitan area. We assign those to the neighbourhood centres that didn't participate. We take all of the figures of those that did participate, extrapolated out to the entire sector over a week. It's 32,000 people, and then we can come up with those big figures on the 1.6 million people attending a neighbourhood centre across an entire year, and 2.3 million interactions with neighbourhood centres. That includes like phone calls and digital interactions, and 956,000 people participating in activities, and number of referrals too. We're also able to collect information on the types of services that neighbourhood centres were offering, which kind of just gives a really kind of broad overview of all the different things that neighbourhood centres do in local communities. Also in our survey, we collected some responses to COVID, because that was just pertinent information for us to gather last year. We're at the tail end of the pandemic. We know that neighbourhood centres were playing a key role in supporting local communities in responding to COVID. So we gathered that information and gathered a bit of qualitative data around what neighbourhood centres did during COVID that we were able to use too. A bit about emergency relief. We were able to calculate the survey participants kind of think that it's the weirdest question to ask them how many kilos of food that they give out. But the purpose of it is to calculate that social return on investment that Food Bank has come up with, and their social return on investment was $20.05 of social value is produced for every kilogram of food that they give out. So we applied the same calculation to our neighbourhood centres. And number of frozen meals, and asked them on a monthly basis how much material relief was being given out. So that's with food vouchers, fuel, public transport cards, that sort of thing. And we were able to add all of that up, and it's $2.8 million in other material relief other than food being given out. And also asked them where their emergency relief was coming from. So as you can see, 43% of neighbourhood centres were getting their emergency relief just from local communities and businesses and that sort of thing, which kind of changes the perception that there is a perception that only neighbourhood centres who get proper emergency relief funding from the state or federal government are involved in emergency relief. With this data, we're able to prove that there are a lot more neighbourhood centres involved in emergency relief that don't receive that official funding through government sources. Also, we had a look at the number of community groups that neighbourhood centres were supporting. And we compared that to the first year that we did the survey. And we noticed that there was a difference, obviously due to COVID, of community groups using neighbourhood centre facilities because there were still restrictions when we conducted the survey. There was a drop in the number of community groups that were using neighbourhood centre facilities. And that's also reflected in the number of hours the facilities were being used. But we were able to also find that neighbourhood centres, although they weren't supporting community groups internally inside their facilities, they were actually increasingly supporting community groups outside in the community, running projects, supporting the work that other community groups do. And volunteering added up the number of volunteers per week in neighbourhood centres, and also the number of hours they were contributing to volunteering per year, and put all those amounts into the volunteer replacement cost calculator. So we use the 55 to 64-year-old age group in that because we know that that's the average age of most neighbourhood centre volunteers. And we also gathered some information about the buildings, and I think this played a significant role in the budget announcement. So those neighbourhood centres that operate from department-owned buildings just pay a peppercorn rental amount, while those in other neighbourhood centre infrastructure were having to pay rent and a lot of overheads and that sort of stuff. We gathered information on, how many were in department-owned buildings, how many weren't, and in the budget announcement, those neighbourhood centres that are operating in non-state government buildings are eligible for an extra $20,000 per year to cover the overheads that they had. So adding it all up, with the data that we gathered, we are able to use the Deloitte method on the number of participants in activities and the social connection that they had, and it worked out to be $31 million in value. The volunteer replacement costs were $36 million. The food value that we calculated from Food Bank was $13 million. These are per year figures that we stretched the numbers out to. Non-food emergency relief, $2.3 million. Other services that were benchmarked, free room hire, tax help, and auspicing. And we were able to calculate there was $90 million worth of community value that neighbourhood centres were producing per year, or calculable community value, because there's so many other things that neighbourhood centres do that we just can't calculate. But from what we were able to calculate from our estimates, around about $90 million. And we also compared the amount of community value that funded neighbourhood centres were producing, and it worked out to be $4.81 in community value for every dollar that that the Queensland government were investing in those neighbourhood centres. And so I think a lot of these figures kind of played a key role. In fact, the information we have is that the department kind of really used our sector impact report and this data to really put a case forward for increased funding for neighbourhood centres. And we had quite a good outcome in the last budget as a result of that, which is really good. Some of the other things that we did with the data, like there's one thing to collect data about neighbourhood centres, and then you've got to think about, well, what are you going to do with that data, and how does it feed into kind of the wider kind of scope of kind of proving the value of neighbourhood centres, increasing that recognition of neighbourhood centres, and increasing that overall kind of perception and campaign around communicating the value. So we put together that sector impact report. So took the data and I put it into a report, and that report was kind of designed in a way to kind of demonstrate the value, but also tap into some current kind of issues that were happening in the wider political world. And so there was that. Put together a value poster, got a really good communications person to put all of that data together and present it in a really cool way. And so we had a poster which kind of is a bit of an infographic that just goes through all of those different figures and amounts. We're able to use the data on Neighbourhood Centre Week. So Neighbourhood Centre Week occurred in May, and then the budget announcement was in June. So, and part of the Neighbourhood Centre Week campaign was presenting bits of data, stories of impact, that sort of thing, and getting MPs on board. Facebook posts, gathering stories of impact from the community, from the neighbourhood centres. So it's one thing to have data, but like I think those stories to kind of explain the data and increase the impact are also important. We had a lot of wrote letters to MPs, had a lot of meetings with the MPs personally, sent them the sector impact report, and also sent them our clear budget ask, which we work with QCOSS and the Queensland Community Alliance to put together in some kind of clear way, and had the data to support those budget asks too, which I think kind of all of these things kind of played a key role in us achieving a positive outcome in the budget. Another thing that we do is that for each neighbourhood centre that participates in the survey, we're able to produce their own individual community value report. So their own kind of personal social return on investment based on the data that they provide. And they've found this really useful. It's a really good incentive. The survey is a little bit of work to kind of bring the figures together and put them all in and that. So it is an incentive for neighbourhood centres to participate. And with that little value sheet, they're able to, you know, put it in their communications too about the community value of their particular neighbourhood centre. They're able to put it in like their AGM reports. They're able to put it in grant applications. There's a whole variety of uses that they can use their own value report to promote their own neighbourhood centre. So I think that comes to the end of my presentation. So I guess that kind of leaves it open now for any kind of questions that anyone has.
I'll just jump in now, Chris, and you know, people can be thinking about some other questions as well to contribute. I just wanted to really say congratulations on this work. It's just so exciting, you know, of what you've achieved and NCQ has achieved in the last couple of years, just collecting this data. And I love your capability to be able to tell that story of the data. It's very exciting. And also, you know, the opportunity to reflect on the importance of partnerships and our friends and working together. We did have one question come through before the like during the registration process, so I'll just kind of read through that question and then we'll open it up again to anyone else who wants to send those through. So the webinar question, it came from a community research officer at Ipswich City Council. And she actually had several questions, so I'll run these off and you can respond to how you feel free to. So the questions were, what would be the purpose or purposes of an evaluation and measurement framework for neighbourhood and community centres? And are there any talks or plans for the development of this type of framework? What might that look like initially? You know, who would be involved with that process, and what would be important to consistently measure And she's also interested in understanding the plans for the survey in the future. So sorry, that's a lot of questions, I know.
That's all right. Well, first off, plans for the survey in the future is for it to become an annual event for us, to survey the sector every year, and to gather that data so then we can track trends from year to year. So as I noted in my presentation, we were able to track that decline in the number of community groups internally in neighbourhood centres, but increases in external support for community groups. Yeah, we are keen to encourage more neighbourhood centres to be a part of the survey as well, so that they can produce their own social value reports and start using them to build up the capacity of the sector. The value and measurement framework, we actually designed one with the sector and other peak bodies and some other research bodies in 2020. And as part of that, we took some methods that were being used in the other states, like a counting week, for neighbourhood centres, where they would count the number of participants coming in, but also conduct participant surveys with the people who are coming into the centres. And without getting too much information from them about their, personal details and that sort of thing, to just get them to tick a box on the amount of connection that they were experiencing from coming in there, increases to mental health, that sort of stuff. So that was a component of our new measurement framework. Also a case study mechanism as well, because case studies are really useful to tell the story, but they're also useful for communications. Because everyone takes notice of, a story posted on Facebook or something like that. And another component of our measurement framework was being able to attract different stages of community development work. So when certain issues were being identified in a local community, how that neighbourhood centre identified them, and then a second level response to that, third level response, like an actual project being formed around that. And that's able to not only progress the progression of a project, but also it's like the canary in the coal mine of identifying which issues are happening in which localities. And then that intelligence can then be kind of fed back into where new programs need to be rolled out and that kind of thing. So I think it was last year, the Minister formed a sector repositioning committee to look at neighbourhood centres. And the three things that the sector repositioning committee would do is it would come up with a program logic for neighbourhood centre funding by the Queensland government, an investment framework for neighbourhood centres, including where to roll out new neighbourhood centres. And the other component was a reporting and performance framework for neighbourhood centres. So the evaluation and measurement framework that we designed has been put to that committee for consideration, along with that results-based accountability project back in 2015 and the investment measurement framework and that sort of stuff. So I think the work of this committee is just trying to bring together all that previous work and then come to some decisions about where to go from now.
Okay.
Did I address all the components of that question? Or
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, all of that history, and there's just sounds like there's so much work going on in this space. So yeah, do you have access to any of those documents, like the framework or measurements that have been, or even the project program logic? I think it's always really interesting to kind of share all of those resources.
Yeah, the program logic, I'm told, will be put out for public consultation when the sector repositioning committees ready for that. So that's coming soon.
Okay, we'll look out for it. Is there any other questions from anyone? I think the chat box is quite quiet. So I had one other question, which I guess I was just really interested in, you know, how it just sounds all like a lot of work. So, you know, the work involved with the data collection process and the resources required to analyze the data, you know, do you think, you know, do you have any advice or lessons learned for other community organisations who might be interested in kind of looking more at these different methodologies to kind of capture the value of their work or their organisation in different kind of ways? Oh, it's gone on mute. Can't hear you. I still can't hear you. I'm sorry, Chris.
How's that?
I can hear you now.
Maybe my microphone went dead.
Technology.
I would say it would be to find a friend who is already doing this kind of data stuff. We wouldn't have been able to do this stuff without the help of Neighbourhood Houses Victoria and David, who's runs a survey down there and knows Excel spreadsheets a lot better than I do. So it would be to find someone who's already doing that work and convince them to mentor you being able to do it.
Yeah, the importance of mentors, I think, is really important. Okay, well, I think we might wrap up there if that's okay. I just had a couple more things to go through before we sign off. So I will screen share my presentation again. And so, yeah, again, I just really wanted to say thank you, Chris, for joining us. We really appreciate your time and expertise and enthusiasm to share and connect. We really look forward to connecting with you again in the future through the network and our work together. So I wanted to launch, so yeah, the last component really is for the webinar today to receive feedback from everyone who's online today. So I'm just going to launch a couple of polls. Can we see that here? So from 1 to 5, how satisfied were you with this webinar? And also, did the content of this webinar increase your knowledge on data capability, evaluation methodologies, for example, social return on investment analysis? So just 2 questions today, and I'll give you all a few minutes to complete those couple of questions. I think they pop up on everyone's screen as well. I also, as you're filling in those questions, just wanted to quickly flag our QCOSS conference, which is being held on the 6th to the 8th of September. The theme is Power and Politics of the Care Economy. And we have some really exciting guest lineup. There's a particular session, a panel discussion on data collaboration, advancing sector outcomes. So we all know, you know, data sharing is critical to achieving systems level change across our sector. Our experts will explore data collaboration and what it means for community service organisations. So our guest speaker lineup is Rose Ahern from Amplify Social Impact Online. We have David Pearson from the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, and Anthony McCrosker from Swinburne Social Institute Research. Social Innovation Research Institute. So yeah, thank you all again for staying online today and engaging with us in today's discussion. We will see you next time. I'll log off now, and you've got a lot more time in your day. We're trying to shorten these webinars to be within the hour. So good work, everyone. See you next time.